I felt that it's a missional situation, but nobody really thought about that. And in that, Newbigin's idea that what does it mean to be a missionary to our own culture in Europe, what he's thinking about, it was very formative, the way I looked on everything.
We're doing a class right now at course called Global Missions in the 21st Century. And as a part of the key course content for this class, we're doing interviews with leaders from around the world. And we are excited to release these to you and invite you to pull up a chair and listen in to these enriching discussions. Today, I am joined by my friend and brother, András Lovas, who lives in Budapest, Hungary. We met a couple years ago in Edinburgh, Scotland, at a City to City Europe meeting, and have been able to keep in contact since then over WhatsApp. András, you pastored for about 20 years. I'm going to pronounce this wrong. The Gazdagret Reformed Church there in Budapest, and then served as a denominational leader and trainer of pastors and church planners for the Hungarian Reformed Church denomination. And then the past 5 years, you've been a part of pastoring a church plant, another church plant there in Budapest. You also serve as a trainer within City to City Europe network. We share a common mentor in Michael Goheen, and so we were able to kind of connect on that and share some common missional theological grammar, and it's been fun to talk with you about that. You got your DMin from Bakke Graduate University in Urban Mission, and so anyway, without further ado, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really an interesting journey to meet you, and then I am so much amazed by your being so faithful in keeping the contact, because generally I'm not always so good in keeping the contact, but I really appreciate that. So thank you so much, Hoffman. I need that.
Yeah. Well, so again, you've pastored many years, so over 25 years now, in two different churches. Tell us how you came to, a little bit about your spiritual journey, how you came to faith, and then how God led you into pastoral ministry.
Yes. So I grew up in Budapest, and my parents, they were Christians in the Reformed Church in Hungary. Obviously, they went through their own challenges in life. But when I was quite young, age 4, 5, 6, they went through a real spiritual renewal, and their marriage was healed. And so all my knowledge is that I grew up in that Christian family with a sister, an elder sister. It's also interesting that my parents were scientists. My mother was a physicist. My father is an astronomer. And so my whole looking at the world and my interest was going to that way in secondary school. I was so much interested in biology, in insects, in butterflies, the way they lived. And so I was preparing for something like that. And then at the same time, like growing up in the church, there was no youth group in that church that time where I grew up, but something was deep in my heart. And in that age of 16, 17, a slow process came into my heart when in that process I really started to see that I need that Savior whom I learned about, So I was living my life in that time and realized that I need that. I'm sinful. And so all the things I learned as a kid became real in that relationship with Jesus. And at the same time, basically, there was one book which was very formative. It's still late 70s, early 80s. So it's socialism, and even Christian literature is not free totally. But there are many books which are smuggled into the country. So they are printed somewhere in Western Europe, maybe in Hungary, and brought in. You are not buying it in a book shop, but you are just given it in these circles, Christian circles. And so I was reading David Wilkerson's The Cross and the Switchblade. You know that. And that really started a deep work in my heart about that desire to see And I think this is still the main thing for me, to see how the gospel, I wouldn't put it that way that time, but how the gospel changes and transforms lives. I think that really captured my heart, and all my calling to ministry started out of that experience. That's how I started thinking and praying, and I was confirmed in prayer that God really directs me to that. So that's how I went into ministry.
Yeah, well, connect a few more dots for us from that point into how you actually became a pastor.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because I told you that I grew up in a church, but church life was very restricted in socialism. So, and the church where we went, so my parents had their spiritual renewal with a village church, with a village pastor, a couple who were part of the charismatic renewal. But my local church experience was really, it was not interesting at all. And the image of what the pastor is was something really. So when I had that call, my heart was that I want to do something with young people, like I read about in the book. And I want to see how people come to Christ and are transformed by the power of the gospel and the Holy Spirit. And so I applied to the seminary, saying that I don't want to be a pastor of the local church. I want to do some ministry like that, which doing something with drug addicts or people like that. And it was very interesting that, so when I applied to the seminary, then there was army, compulsory, 18 years. So 2 years later, I started seminary. And in the seminary, it was still started seminary in 86. So it was still no freedom. And I remember that there was a very important impact on me, that I saw churches, ministries which reach out to the lost. And they were very, very different than the churches I knew in the Hungarian Reformed Church. 1 year I was for almost 2 months in London doing voluntary work just for the sake of language learning with a local church. But that was a very lively local church. They involved me into many mission things with their local church. And there was an international youth program at the same time there. And I started seeing that the local church is just so good. And since then, I started dreaming about a local church which can reach the lost, which is very different than the traditional churches. And it was still no possibility to start new churches in Hungary that time, but it was in my heart. And by the time I graduated, 91, then there was freedom.
Yeah.
So that's the journey.
Yeah. So were you the church planner for that church you pastored for 20 years?
No, it's when there was the change, the freedom, the democratic change, one question for the church, unfortunately not the primary question for the denomination, was that during socialism, huge housing estates were built at the edges of the cities. And there were no churches, of course, and nothing like that. And after the change, in some places, something started. And so this new church in a housing estate in Budapest at the edge of the city was started in 1990. And church start that time was, they started after a while, they started in a higher or rented place, church service, and tried to invite the nominal or Reformed people or those people who were living there. So it was quite a traditional way of church planting. And that small church was 3 years old when I got there, when I was called to be there. And that was in some ways a dream coming true, that there is this new thing, you can do this new thing. There is no building, nothing, just a small rented place. There is the housing estate, 20,000 people around you in Budapest. What does it mean to do mission in a local church in that context? That's how I started.
Oh, I see.
And then I stayed with that church for more than 20 years.
Yeah. Okay. So the seeds of the idea of a church being missional by its identity and and how that can be fleshed out in a local context. Sounds like they were planted in you back in London, and as a young aspiring pastor, were already there. Tell us about how you connected with Michael Goheen and his work, and of course, he's deeply shaped by Lesslie Newbigin's theology of mission and missional ecclesiology. That the role of the church in the biblical story is to be the bearers of God's mission in the world and assign instrument, foretaste, all those things that are classic Newbigin, which are now classic Goheen influences. How did that influence show up in your life? And then how did it shape how you went about being a pastor?
Yeah. I think it's two phases with Mike Goheen. One is that so I had this interest in mission, and I started reading Newbigin. So I read the Gospel in Progress Society and some other books, and I knew that something, it gives me a framework of understanding me in this new church to be in a missional situation, even if I didn't use that language maybe that time, but it really captured me. And I had a very, very good friend who was that time a pastor. She was a pastor in Subcarpathia. So from Hungary, she went to Ukraine and was part of a ministry there. And she went to Grand Rapids and she met Mike Goheen. And they became friends. Her name is Esther Donny. And then with her, she later became an assistant pastor in this church with us. So we did ministry together with the same theological vision for 10 years. But when we met, I said, I read Newbigin. She said, I met Michael Goheen and learned about Newbigin and that whole thing. And later on, Mike, in the late 90s, I think, Mike Goheen came first time to Hungary, and there was a 2 days conference called the Newbigin Symposium. So he gave some lectures on Newbigin, and he gave us his book, his dissertation. And then I did, in the same symposium, I presented our church. By that time, I was there for 6, 7, 8 years, and tried to show them how the way I am thinking about this church in this mission situation is shaped a bit about Newbigin. So this was just a one-time meeting with him, and then later his readings. And then like 15 years later or so, he was invited to do trainings for pastors in Hungary. And then for 5, 6 years, every year for 1 or 2 weeks, we were just teaching or learning from him. And then more deeply, his understanding and the Bible as a great narrative and all the consequences arrived. And even we started doing ministry out of that in Hungary, build up like a mission training school and so on. So yeah, so it was a later stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What as you learn more about Newbigin and then were taught by Goheen, what difference did it make in the way that you pastored and the way your church lived together? And what can you point to any consequences that had?
Yeah, I think the first thing was the mindset that coming from this missional heart in my heart, but being in a traditional church, Newbigin gave me a framework of understanding. Mm-hmm. And you also need to understand that, so after 1990, what happened in the church was a strong restoration framework. Because the life of the church was disrupted in 1948 at the communist takeover. Mm. So, all the associations and home mission movement, everything was closed. Youth work was very much controlled. The schools of the church were taken away and closed. So the church was very much under the control. The local church could function, but under control. Mm. And so when the democratic, open, free life came, the basic mindset was we need all those things which were taken away. So there was this restoration mindset. Mm. And I felt that being in a city, being in a new church, this is not the way. I felt that it's a missional situation, but nobody really thought about that. And in that, Newbigin's idea that what does it mean to be a missionary to our own culture in Europe, what he's thinking about, it was very formative. The way I looked on everything, started looking on everything through this lens. I even said that I'm a pastor as a missionary. I'm a local pastor, yes, but with the missionary lens, trying to understand the culture and then basically build up everything. Like that time, it was quite new in Hungary that, so we started talking more deeply about discipleship, even touched, but didn't see how to go on deeply with that on Newbigin's idea of faith and work integration. And later I learned more from Tim Keller, how he put this missional ecclesiology into practice. That's when Keller became relevant to me. Also, the cultural openness, so the whole idea of contextualization was there pretty much with us. Even the way we shaped the church building, the design, it was very conscious. We don't want to do a very traditional church building, but something which speaks about our mission in that community. So it's more like the mindset, which was very helpful for me that time.
Yeah. So it's so Hungary has a very complex religious history, from Reformation era to communism, as you've described, to then the post-communism freedom, but it's rapidly secularized, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how does this missionary lens equip you and other pastors that you are mentoring and training to have a missionary encounter with Hungarian secular culture today?
Well, today it's more consciously teaching about contextualization, and part of that is the missionary encounter using Mike Gohin's words. Also, the idea of even if it's a church planting design or a church revitalization, the idea that what Newbigin would say that way, that it's not only your message, but the whole church which should be contextualized. So the missional structures, or the structures of the church should be missional through and through. And so in our trainings with this is what we are doing. So basically and that's more Tim Keller put that way, but Tim Keller is not far from Newbigin. And I know that in other places, Mike Gohin is in a debate with him, but the understanding is that there is contextualization, which is one very important thing for a fruitful ministry, and the other thing is what Tim Keller would say: the gospel renewal, the personal and the communal gospel renewal, and both are something which are very relevant in our ministry in a more conservative, theologically conservative, but quite traditional Reformed Church in Hungary. So we need both of these elements. And I think this is what we try to do in our trainings. That's how we mentor people to build up these churches or venues.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, the whole church is still not so much now, but we can still be in this restoration framework, and we did a lot. It's a very complex issue. But church started taking over institutions from the state. So there are many schools and hospitals and elderly homes. And I think it doesn't have a good impact on the local church's mission. Because sometimes mission is considered, you do this, and this is where you reach new people. But through these institutions, it's very difficult to do anything with the gospel. But much of the energy of the board of elders or the pastors goes to maintaining the institution, and that kills the local church missional life.
So with this encounter with the secular worldview or mindset, Keller obviously wrote a lot about this and used the language of countering the idolatry, embedded in culture and worldview. And then, he draws upon Newbigin there, but also upon the Dutch neo-Calvinist tradition of subversive fulfillment that Dan Strange then talks about. And Keller talked a lot about, and that was, he was excellent at this way of explaining the gospel to secular people in ways of, entering into their worldview and their storylines, and then, subverting them and showing how, even on their own terms, those storylines end in a place that they don't really want, but how they're fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Or really what they are longing for, though, in a way that's been distorted and twisted. They're longing for Jesus Christ. And so presenting the gospel as the resolution of some storylines that have their genesis, even in general revelation. But so what are ways that you have found helpful to articulate the gospel in your particular context that really do speak to people? Like what for the secular Hungarian who's maybe marginally, maybe somewhat nominally a Christian, but ultimately at a worldview level, they're secular. How are you finding when you communicate the gospel to them that it makes sense? Where does it connect with them and the light bulb go off?
Obviously, it always depends on if you look at more in more detailed way the context, then they can be very specific in certain places. In a town or in a village in Hungary, it might not be the same than in the city. Though that's true that for the young people, the world is a globalized world. They use the same media and so on. But I found Keller's main emphasis very relevant. Like the same here, that with that generation, you cannot talk about sin in terms of morality. It's not the way you start. It's his approach with idolatry and freedom is, I think, it's very relevant. What we also find, and again, it's Western culture, the whole idea of self-expression and self-realization, it's very, very strong with these young professionals with whom we try to do our church plant. And, the burden, the tiredness, or the exhaustion of you always have to perform more. Just the other day, I was talking to somebody who's doing some discipleship work and evangelism with a parachurch organization, and we just said that, like, I was like a 25-old person says that if at 35 you don't have your own house, your electric car, your nice house in the suburbs, then where are you? Who are you? What's your identity? So this identity question is very strongly there. I don't know how much it's true, but for the younger generation, but for the older generation, where Hungary historically is different, is very different than the States, is that it's more pessimistic culture, not so much optimism.
Yeah,
and people can be more passive. Maybe you expect something that the state should do to you or with you, less innovation or less power of your own things. But it's kind of depends on your age. Yeah, but the main themes are similar, I think, in the Western world. This is what I find here. It's not special themes, maybe sub-themes, but yeah.
Yeah. You mentioning pessimism reminds me of an experience I had in China. I think I've shared with you. I lived there, and
yes,
communism took root there about the same time it took root in Hungary. Of course, it took a very different direction there in some ways under Mao Zedong, but how much of pessimism do you connect that with the legacy of communism being a failed attempt, a failed man-centered attempt to bring about a utopia on Earth?
Not so much that, and it goes beyond, communism. Like our history is quite broken. But if I just go back to after the First World War, 2/3 of the country was taken away. So 2/3 of what used to be Hungary is not Hungary anymore, but Hungarians are living all around in minority, and that was a national shock. And with those families who were touched by that is there. And then again, after the Second World War, obviously we ended up in the wrong place with the Germans, and then the Russians came. So basically, if you like so we had our historical roots, but then in socialism, I mean, you didn't own your own business. Like there were people who worked in agriculture. They had their own land. And socialism came and they had to give their land. And most of the reform people were in these agricultural areas in Hungary. So you had to give your land to the what did they call it?
The commune?
Yeah, something like that. And so you were working on your own, but it was not your own.
Yeah.
So how you work ethic? What are you working for? It will be taken away. You cannot do your own stuff. And then all the way the leadership works through the party loyalty, and then it's obviously it was in a corrupt system. After a while, less enthusiasm. At the beginning, there were people who believed in the system, of course, but then some cynicism is coming out of that. That these are the leaders. These are what they are saying, and you try to, and you learn how to live with that. And that takes you don't have to talk too much, because if you talk too much, you might have a problem. And so it's, in some ways, it's part of us.
I see. Well, the exchange that I'm remembering is I was with my Chinese teacher, and very, very sweet woman, and she had numerous American missionaries as her student, and they'd all tried to share the gospel with her in various ways, and she very, very polite, very kindly, okay, that's nice, but that's not for me. And then years later, I'd already moved to a different city, but I came back and I visited her, and we were in a coffee shop, and I had learned by this point much more clearly that the Bible's one unified story, and that the eschatological nature of salvation, and it's comprehensive, and it's cosmic renewal and communal and personal, to use Newbigin's cosmic, communal, personal logic of salvation. And so I was excited to share, with her in a new way, and I really thought I cast quite a glorious vision of the new creation that Christ's death has secured for us. And I was going on and on about, I was real excited, and I was telling her, and she got quite upset, visibly upset at this. And she said, "You have to stop." At one point she said, "Please stop." And I was like, "What's going on?" She said, "You sound like the communists." Promising this glorious, future, because when she was a child, 10 years old, her parents were both intellectuals, and that's about the time the Cultural Revolution broke out in China, and Mao Zedong sent everybody out to the countryside. If you were an intellectual, you were an enemy. And so, sent everybody out, and they had to work the land. And she had about the 10-year-ish period of the Cultural Revolution. They lived out in the farms, and she didn't go to school. So she feels like they had this missed 10-year period of her life until Mao died, and things kind of went back somewhat to normal after that. But it was a nationwide psychological trauma, and it impacted her deeply. And said when I was talking about this, in her ears, a utopia that sounded like the communist promise.
Yeah.
And so I listened to her, and then I thought, gosh, what do I say to that? And right or wrong, I don't know, but I said, well, it is, in some ways, you're right. It is a similar promise, a better
Yeah,
world. It
yeah,
is a good news. Communists brought a gospel in a sense that is kind of a heresy of the Christian gospel. The difference is, in communism, it comes about one by man through violence, violent
yeah,
revolution. But in the Christian gospel, it comes about through Jesus Christ who suffered violence.
yeah,
So one was a way of the cross, and the other is a way of violent overthrow. And so, that's kind of where we ended that part of the conversation. But that has stuck with me for some time, and how the gospel can sound in the ears of people who've been through significant, trauma, or particularly under communist trauma. So that's what made
yeah.
me think of it. So in light of a kind of overall, although you said not directly tied to communism, but more of a national history of tragedy, which China's history has a lot of tragedy in it too. And as a matter of fact, their dominant genre of literature and art is tragedy, whereas in America it's comedy.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so anyway, how do you cast this the Gospels, the eschatological nature of the gospel, and it
Mhm.
really does end in new creation
Mhm.
in an environment where a lot of folks are pessimistic about life? How do you do
Yeah.
that?
Well, at first I would say why we should do that. And I don't know how we do that or whether we do it well. But and now it might change, but when we started this church plant 4 or 5 years ago with other pastor, a young female pastor, so okay, we were thinking a lot about the people and try to understand their narratives and so how we contextualize the gospel to these people, what way we'll be sharing the gospel, and as we got to know more and more people, we realized that so these people have everything they need.
Mm.
They are smart. They are quite ethical. They do good things in society, and they are spiritual because quite a number of them does some mindfulness or some meditation, whatever. So where do you bring the gospel? And then we said it was very clear for us that anything you do, they believe it will be taken away because of death and the corruption of the world, the sin reality, the cosmic reality of sin. And so we need to emphasize the last chapter of the gospel, the new heaven and new earth. So we had that thinking. I don't know if we did any good word, like in our because in a so I mean in our services it's there, in our preaching it's there, because we keep the big story, the big narrative with us, so it's there time and again. We don't miss that communal and eschatological part of the gospel in our services. But in terms of our mission, we are I don't know. Actually, we are still, I think we should be much more innovative or on how to reach people. But so we identified that point. But I cannot tell you that we did a good work out of that, and we find how to do that. I mean, sometimes in personal discussions it comes out, and I just my colleague told me that she was sharing the biblical narrative with somebody, and the person who listened was and she said,
Right.
it's good, no? Yes, it's good. So she there just felt the power of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's also the question if we are doing this art project, and so we have an exhibition place, the same place where we meet and we do things with artists, and it's not a Christian thing in terms of not Christian, so-called Christian art. So there are the discussions sometimes, and yes, we should find a way how to, like what I'm thinking is one step, that we have this artist community, some Christians, some not, but their meetings are not about openly the gospel or the Bible. It's more about what does it mean to be an artist and understanding the culture from an artist's point of view and so on. And it's there with me that somehow, sometime we should open up a space for discussion about their art, work and art, and them being an artist as it relates to the biblical narrative, to creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. Because I see that there is something very important there, but we are not at that point. We couldn't start this. We couldn't create that space where it happens yet.
Yeah. Like their art is in some way painting painting a picture of the good life for them, is expressing some ideal that they have in some way. Well, to change the focus a little bit for this next question, you're part of City to Cities Europe network. You've been involved in that for a number of years, and then locally, as I understand it, in Budapest, you're involved in trying to help churches collaborate with one another. So in your local context as well as across Europe, can you speak to the importance of collaboration, what that's meant to you and other pastors and churches and ministries there? Keller talked about the need to cultivate a gospel ecosystem. And this is front and center for what City to City is about in Europe. So how have you gone about that? What's that meant to you? What are some examples you can point to, say this is how it's helped? Can you speak to that?
So with let's start in phases. The first phase, when there was no City to City Budapest officially, or City to City Hungary officially, but there were some very few people who have been inspired by City to City church planters. They started bringing together church planters in the city. It was like 15 years ago they started to do that. And I was there in some of those meetings, and just the understanding that we understand each other better than some other pastors from our own denomination, because we are doing that specific work of planting. And so that was just for a time for fellowship, encouraging each other, and praying for each other and knowing about each other. And then later on, it evolved into this City to City to a more conscious network, with the goal so that there would be more church planting and more church revitalization happening. And then we started doing trainings. And in the training, like the 2 years incubator training, after a while we saw 5, 6 denominations or free churches, leaders from those working together. And I think it's just beautiful, because the Reformed say, those whom we generally think about as they are sects, they are brothers in Christ. And they say, those Reformed mainline whom we don't think that they are believers at all, they are believers. And so there is this even in our trainings and all the City to City Budapest team, it's very diverse, very beautiful. And we are very one in Christ and in relationships. And actually, we are having some of us deeper relationships than with some of our colleagues in the next church. And then that would be the second phase, all the work and growing in that. I'm not going to go into details now, but the way City to City Budapest has been built up. And like 3 years ago, with the help of City to City Europe and the Hub City program, we started thinking about a larger collaboration of the city, and that's what we call Budapest Plus. And the Budapest Plus, it says that it exists so that the gospel permeates the city, and by that we mean that more people are coming to Christ, but also more new churches, but also more integration of faith and works. So it's a very comprehensive view. And we want to do it by, we said, connecting, strengthening, and catalyzing churches and ministries in the city. And so it's happening we started 3 of us, city-to-city people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a longer time because we needed to find out what we want to do. And then we got the idea finally that it's not city to city, it's a new name because we don't want to do our own brand, but we want to have something, a platform where we work together for the gospel in Budapest. Then when we understood that, we get another 5 guys. So there were 8 guys, quite diverse, and we worked more on what is the vision, what are our values, what we want to do. And when after a year or so with that 8 guys, we got to a point, we said, okay, now the next circle is, so now we are doing like 20, 25 people. We still always have the focus. One of the focus is relationships. So we don't want to grow more, but the idea is to get 100 leaders from the city. But we cannot go so far too fast because then there won't be strong the relational element. And we always start with gospel community and personal gospel renewal. So we need to give time to that element. And then we start doing a project for the city. So there is a project now with a sociologist, with the hub. There is a project team with a sociologist and some other people. We are just doing the profiles, 9 profiles of the people of the city, and we will see how it can enrich the local churches, understanding this kind of people. So it's happening slowly. It's happening. It's very interesting. And now there are some collaboration because the idea is that once we are around one table in Budapest Plus, like this ministry, this local church, this school, Bible school, then there is trust in there. And so a second person can come up because I know this guy, I trust him, and he is in this relationship, in this fellowship with all the others. So it builds trust and builds possibility for collaboration. And so there are some collaborations started. Sometimes just pastors invite themselves to preach, sometimes sharing some knowledge or understanding. So it's slowly being built up, and it's very, very exciting to see. Yeah, it's happening, and we always say we don't know where it goes and how far it goes. We just do it, pray, do, and have that vision to go that way.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. Yeah. And I was in Phoenix a couple of years ago, and they have the MTC out there, and the
Search Network.
what do you call it? The I'm drawing a blank on the name, but the Search Network.
The Search Network. Yeah.
And one of the leaders in there made a comment that stuck. He said, movements move at the speed of trust. And so when there's things that, maybe damage trust or weaken trust, things slow down. And really nothing moves unless there's a foundation of trust. And, it connects with, I'm sure you've read Household of God, where Newbigin is asking the question, what constitutes the church? And he looks at, well, here's how the Catholics answer that is through apostolic succession. And here's how the Protestants answer that as well, where there's the right preaching, right doctrine, and right use of the sacraments. There's the church. And then the Pentecostals say, well, if the Spirit is there, there's the church. And so he goes through the pros and cons of each of those answers in a charitable way. But he being a Protestant himself, he kind of critiques most harshly the Protestants, and then it challenges us to look to both of these other traditions, but particularly the Pentecostal one. And he made the comment that stuck with me that we basically by ironing out these very precise doctrinal formulations and confessions, as good and helpful and needful as those are, if we make those the basis of our unity, we've then exchanged that for a unity that's been ontological fact, is purchased by Christ. And and then he said we're shrugging off the heavy burden of discernment, which is what the Pentecostals are good at. Like, does this person have the Spirit of Christ? If so, he's my brother. I don't care how he formulates his doctrinal propositions, but does he have the Spirit of Christ? And you can have obviously the right doctrinal creed, but be devoid of the Spirit entirely. In other words, be a pagan inside, an idolater. And so anyway, he kind of brings, you need both, and you need both. And the discernment does this person love Jesus Christ? And does he believe I love Jesus Christ as a starting point for building trust, which then, then we can talk about the doctrinal differences, down the road. But anyway, it sounds like that's some elements of that going on in your network there.
Yeah, it's slowly happening, and it's very beautiful.
Yeah. Well, so as you have a couple questions here at the end. As you mentor younger pastors, church planters in your context, or in other, I know you're part of a broader City-to-City Europe network of leaders. As you speak to younger leaders, what are one or two of the most important lessons you've learned through experience that you find yourself wanting to pass on to them?
I would say that more and more that the most important thing is your spiritual house and spiritual renewal, because your heart with the language of Tim Keller, or applying the gospel to the heart in the power of the Holy Spirit, because that's the only thing which makes you free. Even if when I'm doing something with pastors, I so much remember that I did a 3 days training for pastors in missional church. And I realized that I started doing things like contextualization and missional structures and so on, and there is this resistance. And at that point, I understood, and I put there gospel renewal, because the resistance comes because of our fears. What will happen, or our control, or our feeling inadequacy, or our comfort that we don't want to change, we don't want to start new things, or we don't feel that we are enough for that. So you can do your missional training, but at a certain point, because of our heart, it can stop, and there is this resistance. So I think, but once you have the gospel renewal, you have more freedom to look at things and think through things. You have freedom not to change if you don't have to change. You have freedom to start changing if there is a need for that. So I would say that freedom of the heart, which only the gospel brings, and we need again and again and again, and deeper and deeper and deeper in all of our lives, I would say that's the key. That would be my conclusion. That's the key, because then, understanding culture, doing contextualization, and so on, preaching, whatever, you can learn, you can be better or more instinctive it, or not so good in it, but it all starts with your heart.
Yeah, that is such a good word to end on. I think I'm just going to skip the last question, but but thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a
Thank you.
pleasure to chat and see your face again.